I'm really struck by the fact that carrying in the public domain is only one of the 39 Av Malachot. And yet, the first 11 chapters out of 20 or 22 chapters of the Mishnah of Shabbat deal with carrying, as though the Mishnah is incredibly interested in what may be perhaps the least obvious of the malachot. And in the middle of chapter 9, we took a little bit of a detour to look at various halachot which might or might not be learned out from different biblical verses. But now we're going to come straight back to mainstream carrying. And I just wanted to remind us of a principle we learned in the middle of the 7th chapter, that whatever is fit to store, and people usually store things like it. If it's fit to store and people store stuff like it, if someone carries it out on Shabbat, they're liable for a sin offering. So the question is it fit to store? Is it useful? Now, before we went on to the discursus, so the question is it fit to store? Is it useful? Is it purposeful? And of course, that depends partly on how we're using it. And before we went off on our discursus about learning different halachot, which could come out of biblical verses, we looked at the question of the reed. The minimal quantity for carrying for a reed is something that is you can build a pen out of, because the smallest thing you can do with a reed really is make a pen. But if it's not the kind of reed you can make a pen out of, maybe it's thick or it's crushed or it's for whatever reason you can't write with it. And then the Mishnah told us, as much as is required for boiling a light egg, the lightest of eggs. And this definition of fuel, the quantity of fuel you need to boil the lightest of eggs, is going to come back at the beginning of Mishnah, of the 5th Mishnah in the 9th chapter. Coming back to our Mishnah and where we're at after the discursus, the Mishnah comes back to carrying with the words hamotziet sim, someone who carries out wood. This is classic fuel. Hamotziet sim kadei levashel beitza kala, to cook a light egg, or tavalin, or spices, kadela tabel beitza kala. It's poetic. Umitzar fimze imze. And in the case of the spices, the minimal quantity is as much as is required for seasoning a light egg, and they combine with one another. So 2 or 3 spices combine to make up the mixture. And we learned before that in general, with these different kinds of measures, objects of different kinds in different measures don't combine one with the other. And then the Mishnah goes in to talk about all kinds of different things. First of all, we're going to go dyeing, and then we're going to go cleaning. So dyeing, klipe egozim, klipe romanim, astis, ufua, kedei lifsoa bahen bege katan, ba svacha. Nutshells, pomegranate peel, that's really red. Isatis tinctoria, that's woad. That's blue. Rubia tinctorium, now that's red. It's got little red berries. Very, very useful for making red dye. As much as is required for dyeing a small piece of cloth that sits on a hairnet. This is some kind of woman's hair piece, and it's got a little piece of cloth on it. And that's the minimal piece of cloth we'd want to dye. So this quantity of dye is the minimal quantity of dye that makes it significant to carry in the public domain on Shabbat. And along the same lines, we're going to use the same measure for cleaning, actually. Meraglaim neta vorit, chimonia v'ashleg, urine, carbonate of soda, lye, simoleon, earth, potash, as much is required for washing the same object, washing the small piece of cloth in the hairnet. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to disagree. We'll see in these Mishnayot that Rabbi Yehuda likes to come in at the end with a disagreement. And the halakha generally doesn't go according to Rabbi Yehuda, by the way, as we've seen before. But Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says, Kedei lahavira halakatam, as much is required for removing the stain. And the commentators say here that we're talking about a stain on women's clothes. There's a question, is it blood or is it dye? And if we can use some detergent to remove it, well, if it goes, it's clearly blood, because blood is soluble in water and detergent. If it doesn't go, it's dye, it's not blood. Could be very significant for her status. And Rabbi Yehuda says, look, the smallest quantity of detergent you might want to take out on Shabbat, take maybe to someone else's house on Shabbat, is the quantity required to carry out this test. You might be very interested in whether a garment has got dye or blood on it. But the halakha doesn't go according to Rabbi Yehuda. But an interesting thought. We're still back to the same principle. Is it useful? What's the minimal useful quantity? And so when we get onto things that can be used in tiny quantities, well, clearly, kol shehu, the smallest quantity, pil pellet, kol shehu, v'itran, kol shehu, minei samim u'minei matachot, kol shehen, pepper, olive refuse, different kinds of spices, different kinds of metal. Metal was very precious in those days. Any quantity doesn't make any difference. What if you had old pieces from the altar? Let's say you had a tiny piece of stone from the altar. Or maybe from the earth from the altar. By tradition, the altar had earth in the middle of it. Or mikek sfarim, or mikek mitfochotehem, maybe the worn out pieces of scrolls, or maybe the covers of the scrolls. Kol shehen, whatever quantity. Shimatztinim also leganzan, because we learned, we revised this. It's a Mishnah in chapter 7. It's the principle. If it's normal to store it away, it's significant enough to be significant if it's carried on Shabbat. And of course, we don't let these things go. We store old pieces of the altar, or the earth of the altar, or Sifrei Torah, or covers of Sifrei Torah. We put them in a geniza. I mean, nowadays we put them in a geniza. So if they're worthy to be put in a geniza, they can't be carried on Shabbat. That's significant. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to come in again. Even if you can, also someone who carries out the service vessels of idolatry in whatever quantity. Not that he's suggesting you should do this on Shabbat, but he's saying the minimal quantity of vessels of idolatry is significant. And he has a pasuk. Let nothing that's been cheremed, that absolutely nothing that's been cheremed or excommunicated stick to your hand. Well, what about borderline cases? So combinations. And as we go through chapter 10, by the way, we're going to see more and more borderline cases, or unusual cases, unusual ways of carrying things. We're going to, if you like, gradually migrate from a pure discussion of quantities to a more general discussion of edge cases. And we're going to start here. Hamotzi kupat harochlin, someone who carries out a bag, peddler's bag, full of all kinds of stuff. Someone who carries out lots of things just is liable for one sin offering. And then we get back to our quantities. Zeroneki, garden seeds, less than the size of a dried fig. Although Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer Chamisha. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says 5. Cucumber seed 2, gourd seed 2, Egyptian beet seed 2. Chagav chai tahor, a live clean locust. Some locusts are clean. You can eat some locusts. The Teimanim still eat them, and I mean, I don't know what it's like in Washington, but in a cookery demonstration in London recently, our community Rav ate a locust just to demonstrate that kosher locusts can be eaten. They're quite good deep fried. Chagav chai tahor. So if it's one, but you wouldn't eat less. You wouldn't kind of eat less than a whole locust, right? I mean, a half a locust is not meaningful. So chagav chai tahor kol shehu, a live, clean locust, whatever its size. Met kagrogenet. If it's dead, the size of a dried fig. So yes, if it is dead, you might serve up half of it. Tziporet kramim, bein chaya bein meta kol shehu. The bird of the vineyard. It's not clear whether this is a real bird, by the way, or an analogy to a different kind of locust. Seems to fit. We do not understand what the bird of the vineyards is doing in this Mishnah, unless it's a kind of locust. Kol shehu, whatever its size, the bird of the vineyards, she matzinin ota lirufua, because we keep it for medicine. And Rabbi Yudas says, yeah, as ever in these three Mishnayot, he comes in at the end to have the last word. Af hamotzi chagav chai tameh kol shehu. Even a live, unclean locust is significant on Shabbat, not because you're going to eat it. You're not going to eat it. It's tameh. She matzni'in oto lekatzan lischok bo, because you store it away for a child to play with. And it is a wonderful thought that in terms of these chapters are all driven by usage. If it's used, it's significant. And it's really interesting that we're going to finish this sequence of Mishnayot with something which is used by a child to play with. That is the end of chapter 9. And then it's always the last Mishnah in a chapter is always very significant. And then in chapter 10, we're going to go into different kinds of edge cases, not to do with quantities. So this remark about the child's play is the final remark in our discussion of quantities for carrying on Shabbat.